This video will discuss historical and contemporary political movements which advocate for and engage in illegal activity. This video will discuss these actions and ideas for educational purposes only. In no way is this video advocating for or encouraging illegal or violent activity. To analyze the psychology of political violence is not only extremely difficult, but also very dangerous. Yet it is only intelligence and sympathy that can bring us closer to the source of human suffering and teach us the ultimate way out of it. Emma Goldman. This is a video I've been putting off making for a very long time. I wrote the script a while ago. This is a video that, to my knowledge, no popular breadtube anarchists have wanted to touch very much since leftist content first started to get really popular about 3 years ago, and I can understand why. If you scroll through the search topics related to what we'll be discussing, you'll see not a lot of familiar names. Most of these videos are several years old. I'm going to be talking about a chapter of our history that a lot of modern-day anarchists would probably rather pretend never happened. I'm going to be talking about illegalism, individual reclamation, and propaganda of the deed. I'm going to be talking about acts of violence and the T word committed by anarchists in the past and in recent history. It's not a comfortable subject, especially for me. I do consider myself to be pacifistic by nature. I don't like violence. I do not enjoy it. I believe that whenever peaceful, nonviolent methods can be used to fight oppression, it should always be the preferred option. That said, I am not strictly a pacifist. I do believe in self-defense and community defense. I believe that anti-fascist activists should confront Nazis, and we should all be prepared to fight to defend our lives and the safety of our communities as we are able. But anarchism has a complicated history with violence and the law, and there's no denying it. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when anarchism was at its peak of political relevance, and anarchists were advocating an ideology in the mainstream, which was having mainstream adoption around the world, a large number of influential anarchists and anarchist groups advocated for methods and philosophies that directly called for violence and property crime. I believe this history is particularly relevant right now as the public is discussing things like rioting and looting, which may be alternatively described as rebelling and expropriation or insurrection. And whether or not such actions are justified in our current political climate, I believe we need to be sober and honest about our history. In particular, I'd like to note that Donald Trump has expressed his intention to label anarchists specifically as terrorists.
We are looking at long-term jail sentences for these vandals and these hoodlums and these anarchists and agitators, and call them whatever you want. Some people don't like that language, but that's what they are.
And unfortunately, the government is now following through with this threat. Attorney General William Barr has issued a memo declaring self-identified anti-fascists to be violent anti-government extremists, and announcing the development of a task force led by U.S. District Attorneys Craig Carpenito and Aaron Neely Cox to eliminate anti-fascism as a threat to public safety. And the mainstream press has done everything it can to describe anti-fascists and anarchists as outside agitators and agent provocateurs who are trying to force violence into the Black Lives Matter movement.
In recent days, our nation has been gripped by professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others.
So rather than trying to sweep these more violent and illegal aspects of anarchist history under the rug, I've decided that we should take a candid look at this history. You see, unlike fascists, I don't believe that there's any utility in burying the truth or being deceitful about our movement, past or present. I believe that we must soberly accept material reality for what it is, including our history, and including aspects of our history which might not look that great today. Perhaps the actions and ideas of past anarchists can give us some insight on what direction we might take today. Anarchists have come up with a variety of terms and concepts to define the use of violent and illegal political activities. Propaganda of the deed, illegalism, expropriation, individual reclamation, and so on. We'll be talking about all of these things. And all of these concepts fall under the umbrella of direct action. But I want to make it very clear that not all forms of direct action are violent or even illegal. In fact, most of the direct action activities we see today are nonviolent and perfectly legal in the countries in which they take place. Direct action simply means acting directly, believe it or not, attempting to use the power of a collective organization to influence the world without going through established government or corporate mechanisms such as electoralism. See, many anarchists see indirect action, that is to say, going through official government channels, voting, calling and writing letters to politicians and corporations, and so on, as ineffective and inefficient. This is because most anarchists view existing state and corporate power structures as inherently inaccessible and opposed to the working class. The way most of us anarchists see it, the capitalist state exists to oppress workers, so there's no way for workers to meaningfully engage with or through the state apparatus. Electoralism among anarchists is seen as proven to fail to generate meaningful change, while direct action has been proven to get results quickly and effectively, time and time again. Some examples of effective direct action from history include the suffragette movement, in which women acted boldly, sometimes even sacrificing their own health and lives through hunger strikes and imprisonment to demand the right to vote. The labor movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which used strikes and rioting to force corporations and the government to deliver important workplace safety regulations and the 8-hour workday. The civil rights movement, which used mass protests, boycotts, strikes, and what may be described as rioting to force the government to adopt civil rights protections and end segregation in the American South. The Vietnam anti-war movement involved sit-ins, protests, demonstrations, and other mass actions which drew public attention and directly confronted the United States military-industrial complex to call for peace. All the movements that I just listed were primarily peaceful movements, though the activists who fought for their freedoms in each instance were certainly subject to violence from wealthy entities and the state. Suffragettes were beaten and arrested by police. Striking workers were shot, beaten, and arrested by private agents and state police. Civil rights activists were subject to every manner of violence at the hands of police officers and racist counter-protesters. And Vietnam anti-war protesters often clashed with police and soldiers in the streets. Of course, each of these movements also engaged in activities which were described as rioting by their political enemies. They engaged in many illegal activities throughout the years that they struggled against oppression. Property destruction was committed by suffragettes, striking workers, and civil rights activists, and of course, Vietnam anti-war activists, and there were instances of violence committed by members of each movement. And here's where we begin to broach the uncomfortable topic we're taking a look at today. What we'll be discussing now are the more aggressive forms of direct action, methods and philosophies which directly called for violence, property crime, and other activities which go beyond mere protest and civil disobedience. So let's begin at the beginning. Propaganda of the deed. In the 1850s, one of the very first modern socialist thinkers was an Italian man named Carlo Pisacane. Pisacane was a duke born to a poor, noble family in Naples and participated in the complicated political and military struggle to unite Italy of the day. Influenced by early anarchist thinker Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Pisacane became an anarchist himself. A very short tract he wrote shortly before his death in Revolutionary Combat became one of the most influential political texts of the 19th century. This political testament would go on to influence anarchists, Marxists, even fascists. Mussolini was particularly inspired by this testament, as well as suffragettes and militant workers of the early 20th century, and continues to influence revolutionaries and terrorists alike around the world today. The most famous line in the text reads, "Ideas result from deeds, not the latter from the former, and the people will not be free when they are educated, but educated when they are free." This sentiment became encapsulated in the concept of propaganda of the deed, and was utilized by anarchists for decades to come. I'll go ahead and read the rest of the political testament because it's short, and even though it's the very first text ever written on the subject, I think Pisacane was able to summarize the concept of propaganda of the deed remarkably well. "The only thing for a citizen to do to be of service to his country is to patiently wait for the day when he can cooperate in a material revolution. As I see it, conspiracies, plots, and attempted uprisings are the succession of deeds whereby Italy proceeds towards her goal of unity. The flash of Milano's bayonet was a more effective propaganda than 1,000 volumes penned by doctrinarians who are the real blight upon our country and the entire world." Pisacane was not a big fan of theorists. "There are some who say the revolution must be made by the country. This there is no denying, but the country is made up of individuals, and if we were quietly to wait for the day of revolution to come, instead of plotting to bring it about, revolution would never break out. On the other hand, if everybody were to say, the revolution must be made by the country, and I, being an infinitesimal part of the country, have my infinitesimal portion of duty to do, and were to do it, the revolution would be carried out immediately, and would be invincible because of its scale." So in short, Pisacane argues that revolutionaries must carry out actions boldly and immediately, rather than sit around theorizing and philosophizing. And as short as this text was, the ripple effects it set into motion have sculpted history and continue to resonate with us today. Mikhail Bakunin, one of the most prominent early pioneers of anarchist philosophy, wrote 13 years after Pisacane's testament and death on prioritizing political action over theory and words. Let others concern themselves with the theoretical development of the principles of the social revolution, while we content ourselves with spreading these principles everywhere, incarnating them into facts. My intimate friends and allies will probably be surprised that I speak this way. I, who have been so concerned with the theory, who have at all times been a jealous and vigilant guardian of revolutionary principles. Ah, how times have changed. Then, not quite a year ago, we were only preparing for a revolution, which some expected sooner and others later. But now even the blind can tell that we are in the midst of a revolution. Then it was absolutely necessary to stress theoretical principles, to expound these principles clearly and in all their purity, and thus to build a party which, though small in number, would be composed of sincere men, fully and passionately dedicated to these principles, so that in time of crisis, each could count on the solidarity of all the others. But it is now too late to concentrate on the enrollment of new men into such an organization. All of us must now embark on stormy revolutionary seas, and from this very moment, we must spread our principles, not with words, but with deeds, for this is the most popular, the most potent, and the most irresistible form of propaganda. Bakunin went on to say that anarchists should promote the revolution not by issuing decrees, but by stirring the masses to action. Bakunin, a theorist himself, argues here that promoting revolutionary action among the people should be given priority over building up organizational structures and engaging in philosophical theorizing. Writing a few decades later in 1880, anarchist Carlo Cafiero wrote that propaganda of the deed was the only way to ensure that the masses could engage freely in revolutionary struggle without having to wait for the direction of an elite hierarchical structure of theorist leadership. How shall we begin our action? Just look at an opportunity and it will soon appear. Everywhere that rebellion can be sensed and the sound of battle can be heard, that is where we must be. Don't wait to take part in a movement which appears with the label of official socialism on it. Every popular movement already carries with it the seeds of the revolutionary socialism. We must take part in it to ensure its growth. A clear and precise ideal of revolution is formulated only by an infinitesimal minority, and if we wait to take part in a struggle which appears exactly as we have imagined it in our minds, we shall wait forever. Don't imitate the dogmatists who ask for the formula before anything else. The people carry the living revolution in their hearts, and we must fight and die with them. Let me note one more time that not all acts of propaganda of the deed were violent or illegal. There were anarchists whose deeds of propaganda, even in the 19th and early 20th century, included peaceful actions such as setting up communes and mutual aid societies, or setting up political traps to demonstrate the oppressive nature of governments, such as voting en masse for politicians or measures which they knew that the state would not allow to pass. However, the idea of propaganda of the deed has been largely entangled with acts of violence and illegal activity in the public perception, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. Inspired by the likes of Pisacane, Bakunin, and other anarchist philosophers, spontaneous acts of propaganda of the deed were enacted throughout the 1860s and early 1870s, including assassination attempts on the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany. But the philosophy of propaganda of the deed was codified into advocacy for violence by a German-American anarchist named Johann Most. Most had a revolutionary spark from childhood and led his first strike against a hated schoolteacher at the age of 12. In the 1870s, Most began writing political tracts explicitly calling for violence, which landed him in German prison several times. By 1878, Most was forced into exile from Germany, first traveling to France, then England, where he was again imprisoned, and then finally traveling to the USA in 1882. Most was highly influential and associated with many prominent anarchists of the era, including one of the men who was hanged for conspiracy after the Haymarket Affair, which, if you don't know what that is, it's a very important part of anarchist history. I did a whole video on that a while back, so I'll put a link to that in the description. But long story short, it was a massacre of anarchists in Chicago. Most published articles in newspapers, and his works were widely read by anarchists in the USA and Europe. He circulated recipes for bomb making and was imprisoned nearly everywhere he lived for his extremely radical writing and activities. He formalized his particular theories on propaganda of the deed into a concept he called attentat, writing, "The existing system will be quickest and most radically overthrown by the annihilation of its exponents. Therefore, massacres of the enemies of the people must be set in motion." Most was not one to mince words. A gifted orator, Most traveled across the USA to speak to large audiences, and through his speaking influenced the likes of none other than Emma Goldman. Remember Emma Goldman from the quote at the beginning of the video? Remember with White text on a black screen? Yeah. Emma Goldman, if you don't know, was another highly prominent American anarchist who once famously said, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." That would have been a great tweet. But Goldman wasn't all fun and games and singing and dancing. She was also a serious anarchist who, largely inspired by Most, also adopted the philosophy of propaganda of the deed. Most took Goldman under his wing and taught her public speaking and further educated on his état philosophy. He confided in Goldman that he intended for her to take his place after he was gone. And there's really a lot more to this story about Emma Goldman and Most, and there's like assassination attempts, and there's an ice cream shop, and it has a lot of twists and turns. It's one of the most incredible cinematic stories I've ever read from true history, but it's really way too complicated for the scope of this video, so I guess I'll need to do a full video on Goldman at some point in the future. But for now, suffice to say that Goldman got involved with a plot in which she helped her lover, Alexander Berkman, attempt to assassinate a brutal factory manager named Henry Clay Frick. The attempt failed, and Berkman was imprisoned, and decades later in 1917, Goldman reflected on this assassination attempt. Yes, Berkman was an anarchist. He glorified in that fact because it was the only force that made the discord between his spiritual longing and the world without at all bearable. Yet not anarchism as such, but the brutal slaughter of the 11 steelworkers was the urge for Alexander Berkman's act, his attempt on the life of Henry Clay Frick. In other words, Goldman argued that Frick was the cause of his own assassination attempt, having acted so viciously in murdering his own employees that it was only a natural course of action and inevitable for members of the working class to seek retaliation. A year after the assassination attempt, Goldman spoke before a massive audience in Union Square in Manhattan and spurred the crowd to immediate action with the famous line, "Well then, demonstrate before the palaces of the rich. Demand work. If they do not give you work, demand bread. If they deny you both, take bread." We see then that Goldman saw political violence as the direct result of privation, desperation, and outrageous oppression under capitalism. Goldman wrote extensively about political violence throughout the rest of her life, and believed it was unfair that anarchists had received a reputation for committing violence any more than any other ideology. In her 1917 pamphlet, Political Violence, Goldman wrote, "That every act of political violence should nowadays be attributed to anarchists is not at all surprising. Yet it is a fact known to almost everyone familiar with the anarchist movement that a great number of acts for which anarchists had to suffer either originated with the capitalist press or were instigated, if not directly perpetrated, by the police." These words were written over 100 years ago, but they are strikingly relevant today as police continue to perpetuate violence on crowds and then blame those same crowds for said violence, but more on that a bit later. Goldman was hardly the only anarchist proponent of propaganda of the deed of her era. There were dozens of instances of anarchists around the world attempting to commit such deeds of violence. Indeed, it was an anarchist in Sarajevo who assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, an event which sparked World War I. Now, assassination wasn't the only tactic used by anarchist propagandists of the deed. Anarchists also used bombs and explosives for various political acts, especially in the early 20th century when anarchists became popularly known as bomb throwers in the press and in popular culture. One of the most prolific groups to use bombs were the Galleanists, radical adherents of Italian-American anarchist Luigi Galleani, who mostly worked in the USA. Galleani was another passionate orator who inspired many anarchists to enact propaganda of the deed. As one anarchist, Carlo Buda, famously explained, "You heard Galleani speak, and you were ready to shoot the first policeman you saw." From 1914 to 1932, Galleani's followers carried out a series of bombings, poisonings, and assassination attempts that may have killed dozens of people, including members of the working class, though it's not known if the most deadly attack, the Wall Street bombing of 1920, was actually committed by Galleanists or not. In his book, The End of Anarchism, Galleani wrote that he sees criticism of anarchist violence by the state and capitalist elites as hypocritical. The state sees only a criminal in anyone who breaks the law, and by delivering him to a dozen bigots or butchers is certain to have him committed to the executioner, to the penitentiary, to hell in any case. The conventionally minded cry out contradictorily that human life is sacred and inviolable, and whoever attacks it offends both divine and human laws, while they are fattening their wallets and their bellies without the least scruple, condemning the helots toiling in the fields, the factories and the mines to starvation, despair, and early death, their women to prostitution, and their children to the gutter. Or else they push them over frontiers into monstrous slaughter for the sake of a killing in the stock market. Now, not all of this extreme propaganda of the deed activity was rooted in assassination and murder and bombings. There was another branch of anarchistic propaganda of the deed, which, while often inadvertently resulting in violence, was more focused on property crime. In 1840, Proudhon famously wrote that property is theft. The property being referred to here is private property. In other words, the capitalist monopoly on the means of production. Proudhon submitted that capitalists, by exclusively owning factories and other means of production and restricting workers from owning or democratically controlling the means of production, were committing wide-scale acts of theft. This led many anarchist philosophers to believe that the act of theft and other property crimes carried out by the working class against the capitalist class were not crimes at all, but acts of resistance and survival and reprisal under the privations of capitalism. Clement Duval was one of the first anarchists to combine the ideas of propaganda of the deed with crime into a cohesive political framework which he called individual reclamation. A soldier, Duval was disabled for many years due to a mortar injury and a nasty case of smallpox that left him hospitalized for 4 years. The injury and illness left him unable to work, and so he instead turned to crime, at first to survive. After a stint in prison for theft, Duval joined an anarchist criminal organization called the Panther of Batignolles. That's a badass name. But anyway, Duval and the Panther of Batignolles ended up pulling off various daring crimes until getting arrested for the theft of 15,000 francs from a French mansion. Duval stabbed a police officer while being arrested, the cop did survive, and shouted to an adoring crowd during his trial, "Long live anarchy." Duval was sentenced to the infamous Devil's Island for 14 years and tried to escape over 20 times. Now, incidentally, it's widely believed that the story of Duval's life in the French penal colony was stolen entirely for the book Papillon, which would later become the famous Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman film of the same name, and later become the less famous Charlie Hunnam and Rami Malek film of the same name. Duval explained his criminal activity as an act of desperation created by the material conditions of capitalism and as political defiance. Theft exists only through the exploitation of man by man. When society refuses you the right to exist, you must take it. The policeman arrested me in the name of the law. I struck him in the name of liberty. Duval described his theft from capitalists as justified acts of individual reclamation. Since capitalists steal from workers through labor value extraction, theft from capitalists was simply reclamation of wealth by the working class. The company steals enough from its employees. I, who have absolutely nothing, can very well take a little of its surplus. I take full responsibility. When society refuses you the right to exist, you have to take it and not help it along, which is cowardice. Marius Jacob was another famous French anarchist who resorted to crime with a similar philosophy of individual reclamation. In his youth, Jacob was a sailor and wrote, "I have seen the world. It is not beautiful." I love that line. After resorting to piracy for a short while on the high seas, which he saw as too cruel, he quit sailing and returned to France. After getting caught with explosives after committing a bout of thefts, Jacob was imprisoned for 6 months. Upon release, Jacob committed himself to a life of what he called pacifistic illegalism. After another imprisonment and escape from a mental asylum, Jacob put together a group called the Men of the Night. Man, anarchists used to be so dramatic. And he established a simple moral code. One does not kill except to protect his life and his freedom from the police. One steals only from those considered to be social parasites, bosses, judges, soldiers, and the clergy, but never from the professions considered useful, architects, doctors, artists, etc. Finally, a percentage of the stolen money was to be invested into the anarchist cause. Jacob chose to avoid working with the idealistic anarchists and instead surrounded himself with criminals and fellow illegalists. Over the next 3 years, acting in small groups, Jacob and the Men of the Night committed at least 150 burglaries in Paris. In a 1905 article entitled "Why I Became a Burglar," Jacob spells out his philosophy quite clearly. Not recognizing anyone's right to judge me, I don't ask for either pardon or indulgence. I don't go begging to those I hate and hold in contempt. You are the stronger. Dispose of me as you wish. Send me to a penal colony or the scaffold. I don't care. But before going our separate ways, let me tell you one last thing. Since you primarily condemn me for being a thief, it's useful to define what theft is. In my opinion, theft is a need that is felt by all men to take in order to satisfy their appetites. Life is nothing but theft and massacre. Plants and beasts devour each other in order to survive. One is born only to serve as feed for the other. Man is also subject to this law and can only escape it under pain of death. He kills both plants and beasts to feed himself. He is insatiable. Aside from the objects that assure him life, man also nourishes himself on air, water, and light. But have we ever seen two men kill each other for the sharing of these elements? Not that I know of. Nevertheless, these are the most precious of items without which a man cannot live. We can remain several days without absorbing the substances for which we make ourselves slaves. Can we do the same when it comes to air? Not even for a quarter of an hour. Water accounts for 3/4 of our organism and is indispensable in maintaining the elasticity of our tissues. Without heat, without the sun, life would be completely impossible. And so every man steals his elements. Do we accuse him of committing a crime? Of course not. Why then do we differentiate these from the rest? Because the rest demand the expending of effort, a certain amount of labor. But labor is the very essence of society, that is, the association of all individuals to conquer with little effort much well-being. Is this truly the image of what exists? Are your institutions based on such a mode of organization? The truth demonstrates the contrary. The more a man works, the less he earns. The less he produces, the more he benefits. Merit is not taken into consideration. Only the bold take hold of power and hasten to legalize their rapine. From top to bottom of the social scale, everything is but dastardy on one side and idiocy on the other. How can you expect that, penetrated with these truths, I could have respected such a state of things? Those who produce everything have nothing, and those who produce nothing have everything. Such a state of affairs can only produce antagonism between the laboring class and the owning, i.e. the do-nothing, class. The fight breaks out, and hatred delivers its blows. You call a man a thief and a bandit. You apply the rigor of the law against him without asking yourself if he could be something else. Have we ever seen a rentier become a burglar? I admit that I've never known of this, but I, who am neither rentier nor landlord, I, who am only man who owns just his arms and his brains to ensure his preservation, had to conduct myself differently. Society only granted me 3 means of existence: work, begging, or theft. Work, far from hateful, pleases me. Man cannot do without working. His muscles and brain possess a sum of energy that must be spent. What I hated was sweating blood and tears for a pittance of salary. It was creating wealth that wouldn't be allowed me. In a word, I found it hateful to surrender to the prostitution of work. Begging is degradation, the negation of all dignity. Every man has a right to life's banquet. The right to live isn't begged for, it's taken. Jacob ended up having a long, eventful life, traveling to Spain to support the CNT in the 1930s, and even helping to hide French resistance fighters from the Nazis in his home during World War II. Jacob remained an anarchist until his death in 1954 at the age of 75. Now, remember Luigi Galleani, the guy who inspired all of the bombings in the early 20th century? He was also a major proponent of individual reclamation, which he described as expropriation. He saw the crimes of Duval and other individual reclamationists as vital activity, seizing capitalist assets and using their actions and acquired wealth to spur revolution, writing, "What does expropriation mean? It means to take from somebody the goods or real estate that he owns, claiming he has no right to them." From Saint Clement to Babeuf, Proudhon, Bakunin, and the most modest of our comrades, the invalidity of property titles has never been questioned. Expropriation is legitimate unless it ends as its opposite, appropriation. To make myself better understood, if Tom takes Harry's wealth for his own enjoyment, we say that he has appropriated it. The property in question has only changed its titular owner, but as an institution, it remains just what it was before. Tom is getting rich as Harry did in the past on the shoulders and labor of harnessed slaves. Nothing has changed, and there is no reason why we should congratulate Tom for having taken Harry's wealth. But suppose, as it recently happened, a band of revolutionaries attack a bank. They immobilize the guards, empty the safes, and weapons in hand defend their retreat. Then, having secured it, they deliver their loot to insurrectionary committees to further the revolutionary movement in their community to provide the necessary means for attaining victory. Do you disapprove? No, you cannot disapprove. There has been expropriation, the very expropriation you have invoked 1,000 times as a revolutionary necessity. There has been no appropriation in the sense that the confiscated wealth has been used to reestablish some other private property with all its consequences. We are faced exactly with an initial, partial act of revolutionary expropriation. Besides the material advantages for the movement, it initiates, enables, and encourages the multitude to proceed to the final expropriation of the ruling class for the benefit of everyone. This has been our desire and our aim. How can we curse, condemn, or reject? Clement Duval and other expropriators have never taken for themselves a single penny of the loot that they obtained with the constant risk of death or life imprisonment. You may say that they have used that money for questionable propaganda means and action, and even conclude that it could have been used in a better way, but you cannot condemn. In contrast to Duval, Jacob, and other anarchists who saw theft and property crime as politically and ethically motivated individual reclamation, another group of anarchists had a different philosophy when it came to crime. The egoist illegalists emerged in the 1890s, largely inspired by the anti-essentialist and egoist philosophies of Max Stirner. And this is complicated philosophy. You'd probably need to watch a whole other video. I'll put a link in the description about egoism if you really want to understand that. But basically the idea is, we shouldn't value institutions and social constructs simply because they've always been accepted. We should question all of these kinds of social structures and weigh them on their own merits or flaws. But anyway, these illegalists saw their crimes as acts of individual rebellion and self-fulfillment. They didn't see themselves as acting for any sort of wider-reaching ethical basis, but rather believed that it was the individual's right and pleasure to try to gain wealth through illegal activity. The most famous example of egoist illegalism was the Bonnot gang, also known as the Auto Bandits, for their use of cutting-edge technology like automobiles and automatic rifles during a long spree of crime in France and Belgium from 1911 to 1912. Ultimately, the gang collapsed, with most of the members being imprisoned or guillotined or shot by police, and the French government then used the Bonnot gang as an excuse to severely crack down on anarchism and leftist activism in general in France. And this is something we'll talk about later on, whether or not it's worth it for individuals to perform acts of propaganda of the deed, knowing that these might lead to crackdowns later. Anarchists continued enacting propaganda of the deed until around the 1930s, when the militant labor movement began to lose steam and anarchism became less and less relevant during the build-up to World War II. Some say it's because of the bad publicity that anarchists received from, the bombings performed by the Galleanists and so on. But that was hardly the end of political actions echoing the philosophies of propaganda of the deed.
12:56 a.m., the explosion that ripped through a restroom on the 3rd floor of the State Department. No one was hurt by the blast. Police who were summoned to the scene described the bomb as being a big one. About 20 minutes prior to the explosion, a woman who claimed she was speaking for the Weather Underground organization called the Washington Post to say an explosion would occur and added, "Notify the security people there. We don't want anyone hurt." Here in Washington, a letter received by the Associated Press said the explosion was as a protest to U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia.
During the tumultuous 1960s and 70s, militant leftist groups that weren't strictly anarchists did carry out activities that they referred to as armed propaganda. They performed these acts to protest the war in Vietnam and civil rights abuses. Black Panthers carried firearms in communities to watch and follow police. A group called the Weather Underground bombed several buildings in retaliation for American bombings in Vietnam. One of the former leaders of this group, David Gilbert, explained in a prison interview from the 1990s why he went from being a radical young theorist to carrying out acts of violence.
I got involved with Weatherman and then what became the Weather Underground back when it formed in 69 and 70. And we formed in the cauldron of intense struggle against the war in Vietnam and racism at a time when the Black Panthers, who were leading force in the black struggle that we identified with, were getting cut down and assassinated at a time when we were highly charged and moved by pictures of children in Vietnam getting napalm, massive demonstrations that didn't stop the war. In that context, we came out of the radical student movement, at that time predominantly white, called Students for a Democratic Society. In the context of seeing a lot of the people who inspired us and who had led the protests getting assassinated or put in prison, and a war that was so brutal and wouldn't stop, a small section of what was the broad student movement decided we had to be in a position to carry out illegal forms of struggle against the government.
Is there a communist faction making a big power play for SDS? Is there any communists back here? I guess there is.
Gilbert and other members of the Weather Underground claimed that great care was taken to avoid murdering innocent people, and indeed, the Weather Underground carried out 25 bombings without killing any victims, although 3 members of the Weather Underground did die accidentally in one explosion in Greenwich Village in New York City. Ultimately, however, the Weather Underground failed to live up to the revolutionary potential of the 1960s. Gilbert claimed that there were various structural problems that contributed to this failure.
We made a lot of very bad mistakes in this period of time, and in retrospect, I feel it was precisely because most of us had such little experience with violence and so little relationship to violence, and it led really relatively sheltered lives. And as I said, for my first 7 years of activism, I was philosophically a pacifist. That, to me, there was an aspect of what we did that was psyching ourselves up to make the jump over this hurdle from sort of a more comfortable middle-class life to building an underground and taking an armed struggle. There was some romanticization of violence, some statements made that really are disgusting. There was the politics of the townhouse, which was sort of as a first approach to armed struggle, saying just sort of the bigger the bang, the better, rather than looking at really making actions very consistent with our humanism and our goals and focusing on a narrow enemy and being careful that people weren't hurt. So I'd say it was this level of energy, excitement, pushing forward to take this tremendous leap, and a lot of psyching ourselves up that had some negative consequences. The other tenor was, of course, the majority of people on the left attacked us tremendously, because the idea that being a revolutionary meant actually fighting the government on that level was pretty upsetting. But there's that sense of attack and being in battle, but we in turn were extremely sectarian. Sectarian's a word within the movement, by which we mean, if you're not doing things exactly like we are, you're not any good. And we were extremely arrogant towards other people. We're the only true revolutionaries. We're the only ones who are responding to the racism of the society and willing to fight. And we really turned off and alienated a lot of people who were decent people and potential allies. And not only is that a wrong way to deal with people, it really weakened achieving our own goals, which is to build as strong a movement as we could against the war and against racism.
We're going to replace capitalism with socialism.
This is the National Revolutionary Conference for a United Front against so-called fascism, bringing together students for a so-called democratic society, the Black Panthers, and other revolutionary student and working class youth at the Oakland, California Auditorium, July 18th through the 20th, 1969. The underlying purpose of the meeting was to further Lenin's emphasis on exploiting youth to advance communism. He said, "Youth will decide the entire struggle, both student youth and, still more, the working class youth." The next voices expose the communist nature of the conference and are from top representatives of the Black Panthers, the Young Patriots, SDS, and the Communist Party USA, who were featured on the program.
Even after being imprisoned for decades, Gilbert remains today a committed revolutionary who accepts the failures of the Weather Underground, yet maintains a strong desire for radical, revolutionary change in society.
I'm still a revolutionary in terms of my commitments and my analysis of the nature of the system. In other words, revolutionary means turning over. It's not, we need more than a few reforms. We need a total change in the structure of power. And I see this world as a world where wealth and power are tremendously polarized. There's a small minority that controls it. They have tremendous power in terms of military, in terms of media, in terms of culture. And that the vast majority of people, for the majority of people in the world, just food and shelter and medical care is a major issue, let alone a chance to develop their potential in contributing to making a better world for humanity. So I don't see a solution to that short of a total overturn of power. And I know from experience that this type of power does not concede through moral arguments or goodwill. But there's a way in which I don't call myself, that I find it a little pretentious to call myself a revolutionary, which is this. At this point, I don't see a clear strategy of how this can be accomplished.
Representing the Black Panthers,
we're going to fight some capitalism with some basic socialistic programs. We'll fight imperialism with proletarian internationalism.
We need socialism in practice. We need an understanding of Marxist-Leninist principles so that we may put our knowledge into revolutionary practice.
Gilbert also explains why he felt the 1960s had tremendous revolutionary potential, and why he thinks the revolutionary actions and groups of the 1960s and 70s never went as far as full-scale revolution in the USA.
In the 60s and 70s, it might be hard for people who came to consciousness later or who are looking at this now to understand. But in the 60s and 70s, revolution really seemed possible. And it wasn't just some sort of fantasy or delusion of a few people. There was a lot of turmoil in motion most particularly what we call national liberation struggles, which means people in Africa and Asia and Latin America that had formerly been colonized or controlled by the Western powers were rising up and saying, we want to take the wealth of our country back for our own people. And they had, a lot of those struggles had the majority of people involved. That was very encouraging when you see the most oppressed being active and taking a role in their own life. And America was feeling the stress. There were internal national liberation struggles, the struggle for black liberation, for Chicano, Puerto Rican, Native American, and there was hundreds of thousands, millions of white youth who were in action against the system. And there was a view of a strategy which Che summed up as 2-3 many Vietnams. Vietnam showed that a poor country without technology, if they're united for a purpose, can stand up to the most powerful military power. And the idea that there could be several, Angola, Mozambique, Nicaragua, all these countries had uprisings. And there were uprisings and discussed with the war in the United States. It was really an image that the very strength of imperialism, which is like an octopus which is sucking wealth out of all these countries with all these tentacles, was also weakness, because those tentacles could be cut off piece by piece. So back then, and I hope really when the whole discussion of armed struggle, people looking at it now don't get the view that it was a small conspiracy of a handful of people who had some delusion. There was a period of time, even among whites in America, where there are not only millions demonstrating against the war, hundreds of thousands did things like break through police lines or smash windows, or there were hundreds of banks of America being burnt down, a particular target in terms of imperialist exploitation, hundreds of ROTC buildings, which was the military presence on campus, being burnt down. In the context of the rise of national liberation, we felt that if we could build a strong anti-racist movement, we could be part of revolution.
It's going to be an armed struggle. It's going to be a struggle that's going to have to take place in the third world against U.S. imperialism and in the mother country against U.S. imperialism. We must be clear on how the final struggle will be waged, and we must be a part of that struggle. Students must be opening up the campuses to the working class, must be going into the working class communities, becoming part of the proletariat, and must be getting ready for armed struggle.
Changes in the United States, there have been times when the black movement has been strong, whether it was anti-slavery or civil rights or whatever. And I think the success of COINTELPRO, and of course all the movements also have their internal weaknesses in setting back, both examples of a more humane and revolutionary direction, a hopefulness that change can be accomplished. I think that that's produced a certain demoralization. In that context, you have a tremendous consolidation of the media, you have a tremendous consolidation of police power and repressive powers in this country. So right now it's a rougher time. It looks like you're crazy to fight it, and it could never dent it. And there's a certain immediate logic to that, for sure. History has shown that every empire has fallen, no matter how powerful it seemed at the time.
Another young revolutionary, William Powell, wrote an infamous book called The Anarchist Cookbook, which included various recipes and designs for bombs, improvised weapons, and illegal drugs. In this clip from the film American Anarchist, made shortly before Powell's death at the age of 66, Powell reads an excerpt and explains why he later came to feel remorse for writing the cookbook.
Allow the fear and the loneliness and the hatred to build up inside you. Allow your passions to fertilize the seeds of constructive revolution. Allow your love of freedom to overcome the false values placed on human life. Freedom is based on respect, and respect must be earned by the spilling of blood. I can remember writing that, and I remember thinking that is a cool turn of phrase. Yeah, I was pleased with that at the time. Now I think it's absolute rubbish, but at the time it sounded really good to me. I can see that people might read portions of this book and find justification for doing very destructive and evil things. And that fills me with remorse.
Now, anarchists today, right now, don't tend to talk about propaganda of the deed or illegalism or individual reclamation very much anymore. For the most part, these philosophies have fallen by the wayside, and most anarchists I talk to see propaganda of the deed as a dead end that doomed the anarchist movement to decades of irrelevance and never saw any meaningful results. But does that mean that propaganda of the deed is indeed a dead philosophy? Arguably, the most recent act that could be easily identified as an act of propaganda of the deed committed by an anarchist occurred in Tacoma, Washington last year in 2019. 69-year-old anarchist activist Willem Van Spronsen attempted to firebomb a privately owned ICE detention center and was killed by police in the process. In his last statement before the incident, Van Spronsen wrote that it was time to take action against the forces of evil. It seems clear that Van Spronsen did not plan to survive his attack on the detention center. But there are various other activities going on in recent history, and even right now, that might also be described as propaganda of the deed. You may recall the milkshake meme last year, in which anti-fascist activists threw milkshakes at prominent fascists and reactionaries. Going back a bit farther, you may also recall the famous incident in which far-right pundit Richard Spencer was punched during an interview. And this was followed by several other viral videos of Nazis being similarly punched on camera. The milkshakes and the punches both sparked wide-ranging debates on social media as to whether or not it was okay to punch or throw milkshakes at Nazis. Proponents said that the violence of getting drenched by a frozen beverage or clocked by a stiff right hook was relatively harmless compared to the genocide that Nazis aimed to commit on vulnerable populations. A common refrain referring to this kind of violence is, "Make Nazis afraid again." And many anarchists have argued that these tactics work, citing Richard Spencer and various other Nazi figures themselves admitting that they are less likely to appear in public out of fear of being attacked. Of course, there are detractors of these tactics on the left who say that violence should only ever be used in self-defense, even when it comes to avowed Nazis. This debate has raged online and in the media for years now, and a similar debate is raging now as to the efficacy and ethics of property destruction taking place during the currently ongoing Black Lives Matter protests, which are occurring across the country and around the world. Detractors refer to these actions as rioting and looting, and claim that such actions do more harm than good. Proponents would call these actions insurrection or expropriation, and claim that these actions have led to far more public attention and results than purely peaceful protests have been able to achieve over a course of decades. There's also a great deal of discussion about the role white activists, and specifically anarchists, white anarchists, have been playing in these protests. The media, politicians, and even many activists have claimed that the vast majority of property crimes have been the result of white anarchists acting as outside agitators who entered the black protest movement to cause violence and destruction. Now, it's hard to deny that many of these actions, including the burning down of a police station in Minneapolis, have garnered a tremendous amount of attention for better or worse. As I'm recording this, protesters in cities across the USA have been destroying statues of Confederate generals and other racist figures, which decades of peaceful protests and electoralism have failed to remove. Last week, protesters broke into a Walmart and stole approximately $100,000 worth of merchandise. As a certain anarchist pointed out on Twitter, this could happen 10,000 more times before the losses add up to $1 billion. The Walton family is worth $136 billion. That's the amount of labor value they've looted from Walmart employees. So this all brings us to a very important question. Does it work? Is propaganda of the deed effective? Should anarchist groups consider resurrecting illegalism and expropriation as sanctioned tactics? Or do these kinds of activities do more harm than good? Well, first let's see what some historical figures had to say about the efficacy of propaganda of the deed when they were alive. Beginning with Pyotr Kropotkin, one of the most influential anarchists in history. Kropotkin wrote The Conquest of Bread, Mutual Aid, and countless other books and political tracts which have had a lasting impact on anarchist thinking to this day. I cover Kropotkin all the time on my channel here. Kropotkin's attitudes towards violence were nuanced and complicated. He was not a pacifist, and generally supported the assassination of tyrants and kings in his day. He was more hesitant about the assassination of bureaucrats and agents of tyrants, seeing them as hasty and messy and not exactly the most elegant solutions, but he did not seem strictly opposed to such actions if it would help to liberate the working class from tyranny. Kropotkin wrote in one instance of acts of illegal protest, of revolt, of vengeance carried out by lonely sentinels. By actions which compel general attention, the new idea of revolution seeps into people's minds and wins converts. Each of these so-called madmen would, according to Kropotkin, in a few days make more propaganda than thousands of pamphlets. In 1881, Kropotkin and another famous anarchist, Errico Malatesta, agreed to adopt the policy of illegal acts at an international meeting of anarchists in London. And while Kropotkin did not flinch much at assassination, he was highly skeptical of bombings, writing, "A structure built on centuries of history cannot be destroyed with a few kilos of explosives." All that said, Kropotkin generally favored peaceful acts of rebellion and took the side of nonviolent propaganda in a debate against Edward Nathan Gantz in 1892. Kropotkin believed the use of bombs and violence would no doubt be necessary in a full-scale revolution, but he did not think of violence to be nearly as effective when enacted as individual acts of terror. To this effect, Kropotkin wrote, "When the Russian revolutionaries had killed the Tsar, the European anarchists imagined that from then on, a handful of fervent revolutionaries armed with a few bombs would be enough to bring about the social revolution. Obviously, this did not come about, and anarchists quickly lost power to the Bolsheviks, who favored more organized collective activity, which Kropotkin also generally preferred. And speaking of the Bolsheviks, they had their own thoughts on anarchistic propaganda of the deed. Writing in 1911, Leon Trotsky believed that propaganda of the deed tended to do more harm than good, causing the powerful states of the era to crack down and repress burgeoning leftist movements. The anarchist prophets of the propaganda by the deed can argue all they want about elevating and stimulating influence of terrorist acts on the masses. Theoretical considerations and political experience prove otherwise. Vladimir Lenin had a very personal connection to propaganda of the deed. His older brother Alexander Ulyanov was executed in May 1887 for his participation in a failed plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. In his book What Is to Be Done, Lenin wrote that many young Russian revolutionaries began with a fixation on carrying out propaganda of the deed. Nearly all had in their early youth enthusiastically worshipped the terrorist heroes. It required a struggle to abandon the captivating impressions of those heroic traditions, and the struggle was accompanied by the breaking off of personal relationships with people who were determined to remain loyal to these tactics. Now, I should point out that it wasn't just Bolsheviks who raised doubts with propaganda of the deed in the early 20th century. Even many of the practitioners of illegalism and violence later expressed some regret and doubt about the effectiveness of propaganda of the deed. Marius Jacob, remember him? The anarchist pirate turned thief who developed the philosophy of pacifistic illegalism? Well, he wrote these words later in his life. "I don't think that illegalism can free the individual in present-day society. Basically, illegalism, considered as an act of revolt, is more a matter of temperament than of doctrine." Emma Goldman also acknowledged that propaganda of the deed was perhaps at times impractical, but also suggested it may have been unavoidable given the dire circumstances the working class often finds themselves in, writing, "The question to the intelligent social student is not whether acts of violence were practical any more than whether the thunderstorm is practical. The thing that will inevitably impress itself on the thinking and feeling man and woman is that the sight of brutal clubbing of innocent victims in a so-called free republic and the degrading, soul-destroying economic struggle furnish the spark that kindles the dynamic force in the overwrought, outraged souls of men. No amount of persecution, of hounding, of repression can stay this social phenomenon." But it is often asked, have not acknowledged anarchists committed acts of violence? Certainly they have, always, however, ready to shoulder the responsibility. My contention is that they were impelled not by the teachings of anarchism, but by the tremendous pressure of conditions making life unbearable to their sensitive natures. Obviously, anarchism or any other social theory making man a conscious social unit will act as a leaven for rebellion. That is not a mere assertion, but a fact verified by all experience. Goldman recognized then that individual acts of illegalism and violent reprisal were insufficient to bring forth revolution, but she also saw them as unavoidable results of oppressive material conditions. So this brings us to the question of most immediate concern. Are propaganda of the deed and illegalism acceptable, viable strategies for anarchists living in society today? To even attempt to answer this question, one must consider many different angles. From a moral standpoint, are acts of violence and property crime acceptable? Anarchists, by virtue of being anarchists, do not accept the legitimacy of the state nor its laws. Anarchists thus do not feel obligated to follow the laws of the state simply for the sake of being law-abiding citizens. For the anarchist, then, the decision of whether or not to follow any given law is a question of pragmatism and consequence. If a revolutionary breaks a law, there is of course the possibility of facing punishment. The anarchist must calculate the risks and rewards of any illegal act, weighing the possibility of jail time or violence at the hands of the police before acting. In terms of pragmatism, propaganda of the deed and illegalism are certainly risky propositions. Historically, propagandists of the deed have been highly likely to suffer long prison sentences or have been killed off by the state. Has the payoff ever been worth it? Were the proceeds of Clement Duval's crimes worth the 14 years he spent on Devil's Island? Could those long years of hard labor perhaps been more productively served towards revolution had Duval not been in prison to begin with? This raises one of the most important questions in my mind, the question of the individual versus the collective. When one decides to act unilaterally as an individual, one must consider that the results of that action will also weigh upon the collective, and in taking a drastic, dramatic action as an individual, that individual may very well be robbing the collective of consent and agency in facing the consequences of those actions. For example, if an anarchist were to commit an act of violence, it may cause the state to institute a major crackdown, as in Russia in the early 20th century. It may even lead to catastrophic and unintended consequences, such as the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, which sparked off World War I, which ended up killing millions of working-class people. This kind of consequential calculus is especially important to consider in our present situation in the USA, where black and white activists are both participating in the same protests. White activists have got to realize that instigating violent conflict with the police may have much harsher consequences for their black comrades who they're standing right next to, who are far more likely to suffer from police brutality and who are statistically much more likely to be arrested, convicted, and face longer prison sentences for the same crimes. One must also recognize the different material conditions we have today versus the 19th and 20th centuries. For one thing, most of us no longer live under monarchies, which would preclude the assassination of individual tyrants, which even Kropotkin accepted were often necessary. The modern capitalist state doesn't hinge on individual nobles or kings. The modern state has much more sophisticated technology for investigating, identifying, and tracking down illegal activity. Would individual reclamationists like Duval and Jacob have gotten away with their crimes for as long as they did today in the era of DNA evidence, surveillance cameras, and face identification software? There's precious little question of morality when it comes to stealing from thieves, in my opinion. Expropriating goods from a Walmart or a wealthy capitalist can very easily be morally justified as simply seizing back that which has been stolen from the working class. But the question remains, how do such actions affect the collective struggle of liberation and revolution? And this is perhaps the most important question of all. Do deeds of propaganda serve the collective effort of revolution? It seems pretty evident to me that acts of violence that cause harm to members of the working class are, to put it very mildly, counterproductive. The anarchist bombings of the early 20th century often killed innocent members of the working class, which has played a role in turning public sentiment away from anarchism, as Kropotkin predicted. When the people are shot down by those who call themselves revolutionists, the revolution itself will become hateful in the eyes of the masses. They will certainly lend their support to the champions of order, even though they are collectivists. In such a line of conduct, the capitalists will see a means of hereafter crushing the collectivists in their turn. If order is established in this fashion, the consequences are easy to foresee. Not content with shooting down the marauders, the faction of order will search out the ringleaders of the mob. They will set up again the law courts and reinstate the hangman. The most ardent revolutionists will be sent to the scaffold. It will be 1793 over again. Thus, it seems that there's a reason individual acts of propaganda of the deed and legalism have fallen out of favor with anarchists since the 1930s. Ultimately, it seems to me that performing an act of propaganda of the deed carries a great deal of risk and leaves plenty to chance. Will your action inspire public sentiment to sympathy and revolutionary fervor, or will it result in outrage and disdain against our movement? Will you be able to escape investigation? Or will you get caught and sentenced to 75 years in prison like David Gilbert, or worse, murdered in cold blood by police like Fred Hampton and so many others? It's a gamble. As with most forms of gambling, the house usually wins. The capitalist media will always side against individual acts of violence and illegal activity, whipping up negative sentiment against such individuals, especially if they espouse views that challenge capitalism. But collective acts may be weighed differently. Protesters collectively rising up and destroying police stations and expropriating en masse have had powerful effects on the collective consciousness. When people rise up organically and spontaneously together to attack and resist the state, That's just not the same thing as an individual propaganda of the deed or illegalist maneuver. That's spontaneous insurrectionary activity. As Karl Marx said, the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself. Anarchists believe above all else in dismantling unjust hierarchies and creating systems of open democracy in which every member of society has a voice. In this light, are acts of propaganda of the deed appropriate for anarchists to use? Can acts of propaganda of the deed help our cause, or is it best relegated to the past and chalked up as a lesson learned about how not to carry out revolution? I'm afraid we're going to be ending this video with a lot more questions than answers, but I do want to know what you have to say. Let me know what you think in the comments, but remember, do not encourage any illegal activities, because that would be in violation of the YouTube terms of service. You don't want to violate the YouTube terms of service. I put a lot of links down in the description if you want to read more about this stuff. There are a lot of really interesting articles and biographies. Yeah, this has been a tough video to make. It's tough to talk about this stuff, but again, I think it's important for us to consider these philosophical concepts, especially in the times we're living right now. I ask you all to be very, very safe, take care of each other, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.
Part of the revolution is being able to apply your humanitarian ideals to your own human relationships. And we have to develop a process and a mode of struggle. I think the women's movement has taught some lessons on this. I think the Christian-based communities in Latin America have taught some lessons on this. No one has an exact model, where we have to develop a process of resolving issues, political debate, coming to decisions, which are democratic, which are respectful, ways to raise criticisms that are constructive, that are trying to move forward the ideals of the whole group rather than jockeying for position. Exactly how to do that, especially in the situation of the Weather Underground. Remember, this isn't just a group that can have meetings and can have democratic debate, and if a decision is wrong, well, we'll change it at the next convention. This is a group that's being hunted by the police. People can get killed. People can be put in prison for life. You can't have open debate. You can't have open meetings. In that situation, there's a lot of pressure to become a very disciplined organization, which is needed, and discipline is right. But with that discipline, especially in the culture we grow up in, there tends to be commandism, authoritarianism, status approach. Are you in or out with leadership? Are you higher or lower in the hierarchy? Rather than full democratic debate based on the validity of ideas and the commitment to the ideals rather than someone's position in the organization. What's the answer to how to combine a disciplined combat organization with fully democratic and humane processes? I don't know. All I can say is it's a problem that we have to take on consciously. I don't see models of exactly how it's been solved. It's something we have to be conscious of and take on.